Hi, good morning, everybody. Good morning. So we'll make a quick start today. I've got a couple who have already joined. That's great. So we'll carry on with what we were discussing since yesterday. So good morning, Elena. So if you, just to make sure that, we get no distortion on the recording, would always request if you keep your microphones muted. By all means, unmute them when you have any questions that you need to ask. And you can ask me questions or raise hands, whichever way works for you when I'm even, obviously delivering. And that would help me to also answer some of your queries when it comes to it. So thanks for joining in today. And obviously, we are looking at, continuing our journey on the communication skills for health and social care, or communication skills for business unit. Now, we discussed yesterday, it was a bit of a longish session yesterday because we had lots of assessment criteria to cover in Learning Outcome 1. And what I've done is I've updated the presentation, from what was available upon Moodle. And I will show you today that you can access the newer version of it, wherein I've added a couple of slides specifically for the merit and distinction criteria. Now, in the first learning outcome, as I mentioned to you, which we looked at yesterday, it was more of a coverage related to, primarily focused on, the bits in terms of knowledge that we wanted to get. And this was more so from a point of view of looking at understanding what are the various communication models, what kind of models are more appropriate when we use them during these settings, in particular in health and social care, and then how do we look at technology being an enabler, and sometimes can be a barrier, but generally being an enabler as far as the communication is required when we deal with disability or people with special conditions. And then how do we use technology to remove barriers? Or how do we ensure that the communication tends to be more effective when we use technology and technological aids? So we discussed in particular a couple of them, like hearing in loop, things like, the use of specific languages which have been developed over the years, the British Sign Language and, Braille in particular, when we are looking at people with disability. And then we looked at how do we look at essentially using technology to be able to enhance, communication so that we are able to do away with distortion, any sort of disturbance, background noise, anything related to which basically inhibits the communication process. Now, in the second learning outcome, we are basically going to be focusing on, so any questions from yesterday, feel free to ask if there were any doubts or any queries, and if some of you went through some of the content that we discussed during the session, then feel free to ask me, because what I can do is answer any queries or questions that you have from Learning Outcome 1. I think the main part in that was to understand the communication models and the evolution of communication models, starting from Aristotle model to Shannon Weaver to Laswell's model, and then finally the contemporary model of communication. And in which context they are generally used is the one that you would need to be aware of. Now, in Learning Outcome 2, as it says, be able to, that means we have to practically go about now doing it. So be able to interact orally with individuals in health and social care setting. And there are two assessment criteria, which is one, looking at different styles and methods of oral communication to meet individual needs. And the second one is demonstrate appropriate listening skills. And we've got one merit and one distinction criteria, which basically focuses on expanding the different styles that we will discuss, and then look at how can we use technology in terms of, looking at using technology to be able to then communicate more effectively with individuals, specifically in a health and social care setting. And then the distinction criteria is to basically help facilitate some sort of a Q&A session, which would mean that if I were to ask you a few questions, then what you would need to be able to do at some stage would be answer those questions from a point of view of not only just understanding it, but also from a point of view of understanding the question, comprehending the information, and then basically looking at responding to it to ensure that you are providing the most appropriate response, which can be provided in this case when we look at, oral communications in particular. Now, in terms of the content, we've got a fair bit of content to cover in the learning outcome 2, which means we are looking at basically styles and methods of oral communication. We are looking at different types of audiences that we speak to. What are the various technological aids that we can use? Things like when we make use of software like PowerPoint software, Microsoft PowerPoint, using technology and presentation aids like PowerPoint and Pearson, and obviously using them to prepare information which then can be presented to the families, the patients, the learners, the customers, community groups, and then basis that they ask question answer sessions. And then we are looking at in the distinction criteria responding to Q&A, or it is like a viva voce, which typically happens at the end of a project or at the end of a session, wherein you throw the floor open for questions, and then these questions can be answered by the presenter, or in this case it is going to be the tutor. Now, what we are going to do is obviously to discuss this part. What I've got is a presentation that I will take you through, but the presentation is going to be a bit practical. So here, what we're going to be doing is doing a number of activities to be able to cover, the various assessment criteria. And what I'm going to try and do is, towards the end of our discussion, I'm going to share some templates with you, which you are going to complete. And these templates will then become a part and parcel of your assignment when you complete this particular unit. So let's make a quick start on discussing some of the theoretical parts of this particular learning outcome with a few slides. Now, what we know from yesterday and what I've shared with you is that communication is a process which involves 5 stages. So you have the sender, you have a receiver, in between you have a message which is encoded from the sender side and decoded from the receiver side before you receive it. And at some stage, there is a feedback which basically completes the loop or completes the communication process. Now, specifically, when we look at, different methods of communication that we want to discuss with regards to, the health and social care sector, what we are going to be looking at is talking about, if you recall what I discussed yesterday in the presentation, was when we look at different styles of communication, there is oral style, oral or verbal style of communication, and there is written style of communication. So when we talk about the oral and verbal style of communication, within that we have formal communication and informal communication. So sometimes when you have a gossip or you are having a personal chat with one of your friends or colleagues and you're doing it in private, that tends to be a word called gossip or conversation, which is happening between just 2 people. When you're in a room and you're having a conversation, but you're also overhearing conversations with others are having, then in those cases, these conversations are basically because you're gathered in a room and you're having these conversations with colleagues or friends, and these conversations are between 2 or 3 person or a small group of people. They tend to be what are called oral communication. So oral communications typically, encompass a wide range of styles and methods, and each of them can be effective if they are used in a particular situation and they are used in a certain way when you are describing or making this conversation with individuals. Now, when we look at oral communication, there are lots of different types of things that we will discuss. And these would be around things like, active listening. So for example, in this case, when I talk about different types of communication, let's look at generically first, and then we will contextualize it to, health and social care setting. Now, first is you look at the process through which we look at active listening. You are currently tuned into a lecture that I am doing, and you're all ears, as I sometimes say, or you're actively listening to what I'm saying. And here, this listening is a concentrated listening because your full attention is geared towards the attendance of the lecture. So this process through which we talk about individuals like yourself, you are basically looking at, listening without any interruption and giving the speaker, which is myself as a tutor or as a lecturer, undivided attention, and if you do ask me any questions or if you give any feedback, which is to comment on what I'm saying, then this would be termed as what is called a process of active listening. Now, there is no background noise at my end, at your end, and that is also to say there is undivided attention being provided, and that allows you to imbibe or basically get the message very clearly. And this process, wherein oral communication is although one way, because most of it is speaking from me at this moment, but is tended and described as what is called active listening. Let's look at a second approach. Now, there might be an instructive approach. That means I might give you some instructions, and these instructions are directly oriented at you completing a certain amount of task, or maybe giving you precise information to say this is how you need to do this. Or in some cases, when you look at an instructive approach, you buy something new, and you say, for example, you buy a new Apple Watch, and that Apple Watch comes with some sort of a small instruction manual. Now, that instruction manual is basically a step-by-step instruction or a process which is given in terms of how do you open the watch and obviously install it from scratch or start from the beginning. And in this case, this kind of an approach wherein it is being, if I give you the instructions through a YouTube video or through this and say, follow this step-by-step process to be able to solve this problem, then this will be an instructional approach as compared to a written piece of manual which you will receive when you buy a product. Then there are bits and pieces that we look at in terms of persuasive communication. We can also, when we do communication, sometimes we use what is called emotions or the use of emotive language. So we are going to use some expressions, we are going to use some emotions, and this would allow our communication to vary in terms of the tone of our voice and also the choice of words that we do use while communicating with other people or colleagues within a setting or an organization. And here, the choice of words and the tone of voice is basically done because we want to convey an emotion, we want to express empathy, and in some cases also understand the emotional context of the conversation which is happening between you and somebody else. So sometimes what happens is, when you look at a health and social care setting, the nurses would need to break the news or give a news which is not going to be very conducive. So in this case, what tends to happen is you would generally see that when the nurse gives the news, she would use a specific tone, and her choice of words are going to be very, very careful, because she is trying to then, give you information which is going to be difficult to comprehend and digest. And in some cases, she has to also communicate her emotional context when she's sharing this information with you. Say, for example, there's bad news, or for example, if there is no good news in terms of progress when you're battling, say, for example, a condition or an illness, and in those cases, you would use emotive language, or, basically the use of emotions and expressions to communicate with, patients or colleagues. Now, there are also verbal type of communication, which can be termed as sometimes non-verbal communication, and they would basically consist of things like body language. Now, this is something that I brought across yesterday, and when you talk about body language as a communication medium, what we are looking at primarily in that case is basically somebody using, expression of, their eyes, their face, or, in terms of gestures of the body, and this is where they are using some of these facial expressions to be able to, provide you non-verbal signals or cues that are going to communicate their thoughts, their feelings, their intentions. And this would be generally through the use of what is called body language. Now, body language would involve some part of the non-verbal or oral communication, but this would be done predominantly through gestures, facial expression, your way you sit, if you're in a meeting room, the eye contact that you do or have, and any sort of other physical body movements that you do, which will basically be seen as what is called communication through physical movements of the body, and that would be called body language. Now, there are other forms of communication which can also be termed as non-verbal or oral communication, and they would be sometimes, done wherein you touch, by using touch and your sensory, or say, for example, by using the touch or hugging somebody, for example, and they would be also sometimes, termed as oral communication. Now, let's look at how these are used as different methods and styles within a health and social care setting. So when we look at the different styles and obviously the different types of settings that can be used for the purposes of communication within health and social care, let's look at a few situations. So if I just put a slide here and I say, styles and methods of oral communication. So if I put this across, what I would want to do essentially would be to talk about, various styles and methods through which we can actually communicate orally. Now, this would mean, let's look at a few examples. Now, what comes to your mind? For example, one would be a classroom lecture. So you are essentially attending a classroom lecture. Even imagine you're studying with me in a class, and obviously you're studying with me through Zoom session. And this lecture that you're basically getting is an oral lecture because I'm using voice as a medium to communicate, things across to you. Then what you'll also look at is speeches, or if you're attending, say, for example, an event, and there is a speech by a couple of people, that would be termed as maybe oral communication. You would also look at trainings and, seminars. They would be again mediums in which you would basically get oral communication. So imagine a morning briefing which happens before the doctor's round in the hospital. All nurses, healthcare workers, and doctors, consultants, they all gather up, and obviously there's a morning meeting which is happening, and that morning briefing is essentially going to be oral. So allocation of responsibilities, how the rounds will be done, which patients are to be seen, who are priority, those kind of things being explained and shared with the team who's going to be responsible for doing the rounds today is going to be, say, for example, a short speech or a meeting, but they would be essentially oral communication. A lot of us in the health and social care sector get a lot of trainings throughout the year. So these trainings that we get into, half a day training, 1 day training, 2 day, 3 day, 5 day trainings, or seminars that we get into are generally delivered by specialist people who are trainers, and they would be imparting information which you are required to gain as a skill, and that would be done through the route of oral communication. Now, these may be termed as formal part of the communication because there is a specific setting, and within those settings, you are essentially having this part as, being received orally or verbally. Now, I could also add, say, for example, presentations as a route wherein you would do formal oral communication. If I talk about informal now, this could be, say, a phone call that you get, or, for example, a conversation which you have, say, at, let's say, with a patient when you're, doing the rounds, or in some cases, informal exchange of notes. I would say exchange of notes or, ideas while doing the rounds. These would be, or say, for example, if you have a conversation somewhere in the corner and that is not related specifically to work, but you might have that conversation because you would want a second opinion, or you want to only discuss with the person that that you feel confident with, and this would be termed as maybe gossip. So when you look at informal types of communication, what we are looking at is verbal oral communication can be formal and can then also be informal. So in some cases, what you would need to do is basically look at, segmenting how would you have these conversations. Now, a group discussion can also be an informal discussion, which is basically an oral form of communication, because here you might be, as you're going around in the hospital, you might be doing rounds, but a lot of people are discussing among themselves from, conditions of certain patients that you visited, and that group discussion or basic discussion, which is happening between 2 or 3 colleagues, would generally be termed as, informal part of, oral communication. I could also put interviews. When you're interviewing for, say, for example, a position or a job, that could be a form of formal oral communication. And sometimes when you get into debates or presentations, and they could be, so there are various different styles that we could look at in terms of how oral communication can be done. So oral communication can be formal and informal. These are styles. And then you're looking at the different methods that can be done in terms of how we communicate with colleagues or different patients, or different colleagues or members or friends and family members, and they would all be classified as different methods. Now, if I look at the different types of communication, and obviously if I look at discussing this in a bit more detail in terms of coverage, what we would want to look at in particular would be talking about what are the skills required when we do the oral communication or verbal communication. So when we talk about specifically in the health and social care sector, what we are looking at in particular would be when we do oral communication, we are going to be focused on doing certain aspects. And this part of, say, if I put another slide in and discuss, let's look at what is the purpose of oral communication within specifically as a health and social care sector. So if I'm a nurse, I'm a healthcare worker, I'm a healthcare assistant, I am a doctor, I am a consultant, or anybody in terms of a clinical nurse or a practice nurse, I would want to know what is the purpose of my oral communication. So one of the first things that you think of is, before you even give out any information, or if you look at how would you create a bit of a background in terms of what is to be communicated to a patient, one of the things that you will do using oral communication would be to build rapport. That means you're going to build a rapport with the individual that you're going to speak to. And what you're also going to do is understand the cultural and, cultural requirements of how you need to communicate with that particular person. And in some cases, after understanding the basic needs, the cultural requirements, and you are trying to then going to provide information which is going to help build rapport. So let me start in a chronological order. And then what we will do is, once you understood this, what you're going to then do is basically adapt your communication to suit the audience. So in this case, assuming we are speaking to a patient, so what you're going to do is basically adapt your communication while you speak to them orally after building a bit of rapport. And that would be to ensure that you have a bit of a rapport going, and a comfort factor is there between you and the patient to be able to speak freely. Let me give you an example. What happens in the case of oral communication, say, for example, you are in a hospital and you are undergoing some sort of a treatment. In the mornings, the nurse and the healthcare assistant comes in, and obviously one of them comes in and says, "Good morning." And then you respond back, "Good morning." And then they say, "How are you feeling today?" And you would say, "Yeah, I'm feeling a bit better from yesterday." That's good. That's good to know that you're feeling better. So I'm going to be looking at, giving you some morning medication, which has been prescribed by the doctor, and hopefully this medication should make you feel better. And do you need anything before? Have you had your breakfast? And you would say, "Yeah, I've had a bit of cereal and with milk, and yes, I've had a bit of breakfast." So that's good, because we won't want you to give you the medication empty stomach. So this has to be after you had something to eat. Do you need anything else before we give you this medication? So this bit of role play that I've done will be done by the nurse or the healthcare assistant by talking to the patient. And this bit of questioning, or giving reassurance by asking a bit of questions related to before giving medication, is basically what we will call rapport building. In this case, the healthcare assistant is quick to acknowledge what are the basic needs, what are the requirements of the patient, and then using what information that she's got back or he's got back, what you're going to do is adapt your communication to suit the needs of the audience. And that would be the main purpose of, doing oral communication with the patient. And this, to a certain extent, would involve, various types of things that you're going to do. And they would be things which are related, to understanding the individual, reading their body language, looking at the various types of, responses that you are getting, or varied responses that you are getting. And those responses would essentially then allow you to, get into, by building a rapport, and that would allow you to essentially look at, let's put it this way, allow you to gain that confidence from the patient, and this allows you to essentially provide that information across to the patient. So as you would see, that there would be lots of different types of things that you are going to be able to do, and this would be basically related to oral part of the communication. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Any questions? Okay, now what we will then look at is go into the second assessment criteria. Now, the second assessment criteria basically talks about, demonstrating appropriate, listening skills. Now, the second criteria talks about how do we demonstrate. That means we need to be able to, showcase various types of listening skills that we can use to build our communication. Now, what you need to be able to think of is various types of skills. When we talk about what we look at here in this case is when we look at listening in, and if you remember the communication process as a loop gets completed when you say something, the listeners get that message, they respond by giving you feedback, and that feedback helps to close that loop that yes, what you're discussing or what you're speaking about is actually, for the intended audience is making that impact, and that audience or the person who's actually listening into you is able to understand what is being said. So in this case, when we talk about listening right now, wherein you are listening, so in this case, when we say listening, you are listening to me actively in terms of giving me full attention. And that would be the first part when we talk about active listening skills. That means you're paying attention. You're also paying attention by ensuring that there are no distractions or anything that would take you away from attending this session or getting this message across clearly. In some cases, your active listening skills would also involve asking questions, which is basically questions relevant to what I'm speaking, what I'm discussing. And this would be to look at either seeking a clarification or getting a bit more information about what is being discussed. And this would be looking at, giving appropriate, appropriate, attention to what is being discussed and spoken about by the presenter. You also sometimes will look at, avoiding any, say, for example, the interruptions. So sometimes you'll have to, you will, just as a basic courtesy, wait for me to stop or finish a particular sentence and then ask me what the question is without interrupting. Or in some cases, you might ask me a question by the chat route as you're doing. And in this case, what this would mean is that when you're listening, what you're also trying to do is avoid any interruptions which would interrupt the speaker and, dissuade the speaker away from the thoughts that he's trying to, convey. So interruptions can be seen sometimes as disrespectful, and they can also suggest that you're more interested in your own ideas than what the other person is actually, saying. So sometimes when you strike conversations, what you do is you have these conversations in short sentences. What you do is you allow the patient to speak. So for example, if you have to give some information, you would break it down into a number of, smaller bunches or pieces. And what you'll do is communicate some part of it and then give a bit of pause, allow the patient to react or ask any question. If doesn't, then you convey the second part of the information. The third part, and this avoids interruptions, but also ensures that the information being transmitted is being done in a very positive manner. Now, when we look at the whole process of active listening or listening skills, there is one theoretical model that we have to look at, and this theoretical model that we talk about is basically the SOLAR model. Now, the SOLAR model is primarily a model which was developed by Gerard Egan, and is based on the approaches used in counseling. Now, the SOLAR model basically is a model that the SOLAR is an acronym for S stands for sit squarely, which is basically sit squarely. O stands for open position. L stands for lean slightly. E stands for eye contact, and R stands for relax. Now, this is an acronym which obviously has come to be known as what is called the SOLAR model. And the SOLAR model primarily is a model developed and proposed by Gerard Egan. And he basically said that while, obviously the approach was used in counseling, but what he meant when he proposed this model is that this model can also be used in a health and social care setting. Because when you have these conversations between the patient and the practitioners, which is basically health and social care staff, then what sometimes you need to be able to do is, when you are having these conversations, you need to have these 5 ingredients in that conversation, which constitute what is called active listening. So sit squarely means you need to be able to position yourself, and your body should be facing the person that you're actually speaking, so that you are basically showing that your conversation with the individual is important, and this conversation is squarely being done with that individual. You have an open position. That means you don't cross your arms or cross your legs. You sit comfortably, and what you're going to do is not move around too much, but what you're going to do is obviously listen attentively to the person when they feedback or give you comments or give remarks on your conversation. Then sometimes you would see, if people are laid back on the chair, or if they are seemingly disinterested, then you generally see people lean back onto the chair, or they are standing. There's a let's say a bit bigger amount of distance between you and somebody else that you're talking, which shows that you're less interested. And in cases of active listening, what we need to be able to ensure is that you're leaning slightly towards the individual to show the focus that you are essentially attending, interested in the student. And then eye contact is important. And then what you do is, when you are having this conversation, you're feeling relaxed. You're not actually, twisting your pen or playing with your, pencil or a pen, and you're not scribbling anything. Your attention is fully provided to the individual that you're having the conversation with. And in this case, sometimes when you speak, they are listening, and when they speak, you're not actually, you're actually, paying attention to what they're saying, rather than, fidgeting about or, creating any sort of distraction. So this model is very useful when we talk about active listening. Now, one of the other things that we look at when active listening is done is that sometimes when you look at, play schools, or when you look at situations wherein, a teacher is trying to, obviously control, say, for example, a class of a number of students or number of children. And in this case, what you will generally see, some of the communication which the teacher does in the class, in order to build a good relationship with the children she cares for or she's managing, what you will generally see is that she will place, and she would essentially create certain signs, or go to words. Essentially, they would mean a lot to that particular child. And similarly, when you look at health and social care setting, what will happen is there are certain ways in which you will communicate certain things. So, for example, are my bloods good? And the nurse would reply, yeah, the test results are now currently being processed, and I'll let you know once they come back. So your communication is something which is going to be succinct, which is going to be precise, and it is going to be useful and engaging with the patient. And that would be, only possible if you're actively listening in to what the patient is actually asking. And when we talk about the whole process of how we demonstrate, listening skills, there is listening and attending. Sometimes you hear the term that, he's physically present, but mentally he's somewhere else. That means you're present in the room, you're yawning, your eyes are rolling, you might not be listening in, you might be physically there, but you might not be attentively listening. And in those cases, it would mean that you're basically physically present, but mentally you're elsewhere because you're thinking of other situations or other conditions or other maybe areas in terms of, listening. So in this case, what you will generally see is that, these kind of things would be more or less required if at all, you are, if you are basically having this conversation with the patient. So you need to be able to give attention to sometimes things which we pick up as, visual signs. If the patient is in pain, if the patient is not being able to react. So in those cases, that would mean that, we would basically ensure that we are able to pick up, the basic bits done with regards to, understanding what the patient is actually trying to communicate. And sometimes, giving them undivided attention would also be considered as a process or a part of listening or being present in that conversation. And some of these signs could be, visual signs through body language, or, in a small way, if the patient is under a lot of pain, they might just whisper, I'm in a lot of pain, or can you give me some painkillers? So in those cases, these are aspects that you'll have to look at when we talk about, active listening skills. Now, in some cases, you would also look at, when we talk about aspects of listening, we would also talk about, basically linguistic aspects of speech. For example, the use of actual words, or, the use of phonetics. Sometimes we use certain type of syntax, jargons, the way we communicate this. And overall, what we need to be able to do is our process of speaking should be such that it allows people to be able to, grasp and easily understand what we are speaking. So the linguistic aspect of speech refers to various components and characteristics that make up human language. So for example, when it is produced and spoken, so I might be using different phonetics, I might be using different syntax, semantics, or, different types of pragmatics to be able to make an impression. A simple example of this would be if I suddenly now start speaking a bit louder, and this is because I want to get your attention. What you see now in my change of tone and voice have I done is I've used certain aspects of my speech, things like my phonetics, my tone, and what I did was I started speaking a bit louder, and that aspect of listening is primarily done to get your attention. And this is where I would say, the aspects of active listening also are related to the linguistic aspect of speech. Now, when I talk about paralinguistics, what it is also known as is what is called as vocalics. Now, vocalics is basically the non-verbal element of communication that normally accompanies a spoken language. So this could be, which I gave an example earlier, was vocal clues and features such as my tone of voice, my pitch, my volume, and the speed at which I'm speaking, and how I'm conveying the thoughts that are related to this session. And they would be essentially what are called paralinguistic cues that you are looking at, which are essential parts of, human communication. So my timing, my tone, my voice, my pitch, my accent is going to constitute that. And then when we talk about body language, as I mentioned before, body language would consist of, things like facial expressions, gestures, posture, eye contact, proximity in terms of how close you are, and then touch, and then obviously looking at the various aspects of body language which can provide clues to people when they come across from various cultural backgrounds and obviously upbringings, and they observe different norms because every individual is different. And when you're dealing with patients within a setting, you know that every patient is different and they might want to observe different things to which you need to be sensitive about when we talk about the concept of active listening. Then there are what are called behavioral aspects of listening as well. So when we talk about behavioral aspects of listening, what we are looking at is behavioral aspects of listening would include things like how do you sit in a room? How do you, for example, maintain eye contact? How do you essentially relate to, comprehending to people's messages which are coming across? So something very closely related to the solar model, but essentially they would relate to the aspects of body language and the way it is used in having that communication would constitute what is called behavioral aspects of listening. Now, what are the various blocks to effective listening? So, for example, we talk about demonstrating appropriate listening skills, but what we also want to do is understand what are the various aspects of effective listening. And in some cases, what would block, effective listening? So in this case, sometimes you could see that if you have your own problems, then your mind is somewhere else, and you are, not able to respond to situations promptly. Sometimes you see that if you're being overworked, or if you're too worked and too engrossed in work, stress and anxiety could be an issue which could block, your way of how you receive information. And sometimes it is a case of, you're not feeling well, or uncomfortable situations, or basically looking at sometimes having conversations which you feel are not making sense or are vague, and you want to basically, stay away from those conversations. And they could be blocks which could essentially be, restricting you as a practitioner in health and social care to be able to, listen into your patients or, their conditions when they are referring to the process of sharing information. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? So what we are going to do is go across to, the merit criteria, which says appropriate methods, including technology, that can be used to present, information orally. Now here, what we need to be able to do is basically talk about a few devices or few types of devices that are used generally, within the National Health Service or in a health and social care setting, and how they can help in better communication, specifically related when we are doing verbal or oral communication. Now, there are lots of different types of communication aids that we can look at in technology. So for example, looking at making a presentation like I'm doing using a PowerPoint slide, you could be using audio-visual aids like a video camera or web camera essentially, and a microphone to be able to use and convey and have that conversation with the conversation going live, to the listeners. You might use, for example, interactive boards or whiteboards or some sort of boards essentially to be able to write some parts of the communication which could complement what I'm actually speaking. So sometimes when I speak to you and say, for example, I would want to insert a slide, and what I'm doing is, although I'm speaking orally or verbally right now, but what I would want to do is complement some points which I would want you to understand in terms of, how can we present information, orally using technology. So here in this case, if I'm writing right now as well, and then obviously giving you some instructions. So for example, making a presentation, using props and say media aids. For example, this is use of sign and symbols to be able to show sometimes to patients that this is what I mean, or sometimes when you enter a ward, it says no phones. There is a visual poster there and it says no phones. Or if you go to a particular building and it has wheelchair access and it is a cross next to it, that means there is no wheelchair access. So here what we are using is media and props essentially, which are going to be used as visual aids to be able to provide messaging across to the audience. It could be diagrams, objects, posters, handouts, some sort of flyers. So they will all be used as tools to be able to communicate information to the patient or to the audience. You might use, say, whiteboards, or say any sort of technological, display screen. Sometimes when you go to the surgery, you have a waiting list, which is normally shown this, waiting number 29 is currently on, or you have some visual aids which are essentially being used at the surgery to, for example, share information about the waiting list with other patients waiting to be seen by the GP, and they would be technological, displays or aids. You could also use what is called audio visual equipment. So here, when we talk about hearing in loop, for example, for people who have disability during, for hearing, and if they are, if they need a technological aid, then hearing in loop are installed at the bank at certain public places where, say, for example, they could use this as a technology to, better hear or obviously comprehend and listen into the information which is being given. And sometimes what you would also see in some cases is that alongside the use of hearing aids, you would also see, say, I would say, let's say, other equipment which could be useful, to display information, which is, and this display of information, if I say, like sometimes when we watch movies or when we watch certain aspects of it, you will see subtitles being used. And this is, although there is, information being communicated verbally, but at the same time, there are subtitles switched on, and these are going to be complementing what the information is currently being shared. So in some cases, you would look at, these being used, as technology is being used to primarily, provide this information, and it is complementing or supplementing the information which is being provided primarily, to send this information across to patient or a large set of audience. You would see display screens, essentially, which are put up in open areas, and they would generally be put in because sometimes providing information through and complementing information which is being spoken about, but also complementing it with maybe a diagram or a chart or a, some sort of a, let's say, visual material would allow the information to be consumed and understood more clearly. Is that okay? So here, what we are looking at is, in this particular task, you're using appropriate methods, including technology, to basically give examples of how information can be, how technology can be used to provide or deliver oral communication in a health and social care setting. So some of these can be used as examples, or software can be used as examples to discuss this merit criteria. Any questions on this so far? Okay, this brings us to the last part, which is the distinction criteria, which basically is related to manage and facilitate a Q&A session. And this would be looking at demonstrating the knowledge that you have got and the skills that you have gained by going through this communication unit. And this would be a part and parcel of what is called the Q&A, which you will need to do with me as a tutor. So here, the idea would be, I would ask you certain questions and you would need to respond to those questions. These questions are going to be related to the health and social care setting, which means I'm going to be looking at towards the end of the unit. When we cover Learning Outcome 3 tomorrow, we are going to be doing this as a part of a discussion for you to achieve maybe distinction in this unit. And this task would basically be a facilitated Q&A session that I will hold with you for about 4 or 5 minutes, a couple of questions related to your assignment that I may ask, and you would explain those questions which I ask by providing some additional information verbally. And that session we are going to record on the Zoom meeting or the Zoom call that we do, and that would facilitate this distinction criteria, or you meeting the criteria for distinction for this task 2D1, because what you have done is you've managed and facilitated a question and an answer session, which is used to demonstrate the subject knowledge, which is communication skills in health and social care, and how they can be used, the process of active listening and, the oral communication, verbal communication can be used, to effectively understand and give across, a situation, or maybe give across information on a situation to a particular patient. Is that okay? Any questions on today's session that we have discussed learning outcome 2. So feel free to ask me any questions, but basically because this is a practical aspect of it. So what we need to be able to do is, get down to obviously 2D1. We are going to cover off. We are going to cover off this 2D1 because what you're going to do is essentially then send me an email, and once you're ready with your Q&A, you will also email me a set of Q&A that you want to discuss with me. And that is something that we will do as a bit of a Zoom meeting or a call on a one-on-one basis. And that would be looking at meeting this particular criteria. So a copy of this, session would be available on YouTube just after when we finish in a couple of minutes. And then what I'm also going to do is show you where I've uploaded, the new version of the LO1 presentation, which you should be able to access, keeping in mind that presentation is slightly updated because it has targeted content related to the aspects of 1M1 and 1D1, which we looked at yesterday in our journey for discussing the first learning outcome. So let me show you very quickly in terms of the presentation that I have uploaded so that you're able to, obviously get the updated version. So let me switch you over. So this is where, the updated presentation has been uploaded. LO1, it says -2023. And what I'm going to do is at some stage move this, I'll leave it here for now. And I'm going to also upload the updated version of the LO2 presentation so that it is clearly visible and available to you with regards to, revisiting any of these sessions that we are holding. Let me just get this across as well. So this is where you'll pretty much have this as a differentiator. Just very briefly, July 23 session. Just as a bit of a distinction between the two, so that you are clear that these are the ones that you need to be able to access, and that would be something that you'll be able to see primarily on your site on Moodle. So hopefully, if you need to revisit any of the sessions and recordings, you would be able to do that promptly, straight away. And what I would do is I'm going to add these two sessions so that you're able to access them in the same location. So any questions on today's discussion, do let me know. And if there are none, then what we will do is we're going to end today's session. And what we will do is, meet up tomorrow to discuss the last and the final learning outcome of this unit. And that is basically looking at, evidence of written communication so that we are able to complete this unit this week. So these should be available to you straight away, just from this side. So you've got LO1, sorry. So these are arranged as well so that you are able to, refer to these recordings from Moodle itself. So we'll have this session tomorrow, same time, at 11 o'clock. So just make sure that you're attending the tomorrow's session as well, because tomorrow's session is going to be focused on essentially coverage of, learning outcome 3 in order to be able to complete this unit. And we are only looking at communicating, looking at the written techniques for communication tomorrow. So thank you so much for attending, and I will see you tomorrow at 11 a.m. And I will drop the message right now on the WhatsApp for the session codes for tomorrow.